Everybody hates the protagonist, even the hardcore fans. Obviously, that's not how it starts, but the longer you watch, the more cracks you start to notice. Take Goku. He's been getting new transformations and hairstyles for decades. His power is constantly evolving. But the problem is, Goku mostly changes on the outside. Despite gaining all that power, he keeps falling back into the same habits. Same thing with Ichigo. He stands out from the average shonen lead because of how grounded and serious he is. But he rarely decides where the story goes for himself. It's hard to stay invested in a protagonist when they don't have an active goal pulling them forward. As for Naruto, he's incredible at understanding people's trauma and helping them heal. But almost every major bond he forms comes back to shared pain. At a certain point, that starts feeling less like a friendship and more like a trauma bonding group therapy session. But then there's Monkey D. Luffy, because somehow none of this happens to him. Luffy doesn't need to become a completely different person to grow. He doesn't need to wait for the plot to give him something to want. And he doesn't need to share someone's trauma before deciding he cares about them. More than 25 years later, people still love Luffy for basically the same reasons they loved him at the beginning. Of course, it's not just because he has cool ass formations and devil fruit powers. That does help. But fans, they just still like the guy. How did Oda create a protagonist who could become stronger, more important, and more legendary, without slowly losing the qualities that made people love him in the first place? To find the answer to that question for the past few months, I drowned myself in everything One Piece. Of course, I came across some obvious answers. Some people say it's his power. He definitely has beaten a lot of enemies, especially with his new form. Others think it's his personality. His optimistic and happy-go-lucky nature is definitely fun to watch. And a lot of people point to the fact that he never gives up. Here's the problem with the last one. If that were really the answer, half of shonen MCs would be just as beloved as Luffy, and they're not. The real reasons start much earlier than any fight scene or personality trait. It's not about what Luffy does when the stakes get high. It's about something Oda established about Luffy before he ever threw a serious punch. Back when he popped out of a barrel and helped Kobe take down Alvida, that Luffy's still the same Luffy we all love and adore more than 1,000 chapters later. And Oda only managed to preserve him by avoiding 3 traps that most protagonists eventually fall into. Ones that slowly strip away the qualities we fell in love with. And once they're in one, there's almost no writing your way out of it. Look, I love Goku as much as you. He's probably the reason half of us started watching anime in the first place. But self-improvement is not exactly his strong suit. Because Goku is a victim of something called character regression. Trap 1. Dragon Ball has a pretty familiar formula. A new villain shows up threatening Earth. Goku gets stronger, unlocks another form with a slightly different hair color, and the numbers go up again. Arc after arc. But look closely at what actually changes. His power grows constantly. His character not nearly as much. The clearest example comes during the Cell Saga of Dragon Ball Z. Goku realizes Gohan is the one with the power to defeat Cell. So he gives up his own fight and sends his 11-year-old son instead. And before Gohan fights him, Goku tosses Cell a Senzu Bean. He knows Cell could kill everyone there, and he heals him anyway. Because Goku believes in Gohan's power and wants him to fight Cell at full strength. In Goku's defense, he's not being entirely selfish. He genuinely believes Gohan can win. The problem is, Cell doesn't give a shit about Goku's idea of a fair fight. And we all know how that ended. That wouldn't be so bad if it were just the one time though. Because decades later, in Dragon Ball Super, Goku does it again. Moro's standing there, a monster who's already drained entire planets dry. And once Goku gets the upper hand, he gives him another chance. Again. Because Goku still wants to fight to end on his terms. So once again, his love of fighting gives the villain room to become dangerous. 2 different villains, decades apart. And Goku still essentially makes the same mistake. I mean, bro, fighting is fun and all, but the entire universe is at stake. Still, to Goku, a fight to death can still feel like 2 kids playing with swords. That's who he's been since he was a kid on Mount Paozu. I get it, that childishness is a part of the appeal. The problem is that the consequences of that childishness rarely change the way he behaves the next time around. The mistake happens, people suffer, the world eventually gets saved, and Goku walks into the next crisis, and we all know he would make the same call again. So the audience watches a character become infinitely stronger without becoming wise enough to match the strength. And that's the danger of character regression. Now Goku still has one thing keeping him firmly at the center of his own story. He knows exactly what he wants, to keep pushing past his limits. But what happens when a protagonist doesn't even have that? The second pattern is what I call the passive protagonist. A passive protagonist isn't someone who literally does nothing. It's someone whose story usually needs something to happen to them before they have somewhere to go. And once you notice it, you can't stop seeing it. Deku wants to become the world's #1 hero so he can save people the way All Might saved him. Gon wants to become a licensed hunter so he can find the father who disappeared on him. Asta wants to become Wizard King to prove a magicless peasant can stand at the top of a world built on magic. Every one of them is chasing something they chose. Ichigo isn't. He's not a completely blank slate. His mother was killed by a hollow when he was a kid, and that gives him a very real reason to protect the people around him. But that's the problem. His motivation usually begins as a response to something that already happened, not something he decided he wanted to do before the plot arrived. You can see it clearest at the start of the Soul Society arc. Rukia gets dragged back to being executed, so Ichigo invades an entire afterlife to save her. That's a huge decision, but the story still had to take Rukia away before Ichigo had a reason to go there. Then it happens again with Orihime. She gets taken to Hueco Mundo, so Ichigo invades enemy territory to bring her back. Again, he's brave, and again, he's willing to throw himself into impossible danger for someone he cares about. But again, the destination was chosen for him before he ever started moving. That's the pattern. Ichigo doesn't usually wake up and decide where his story is going next. The story gives him someone to save, somewhere to defend, or a threat he has to respond to. And then Ichigo reacts. So this constant need for something to happen before he moves the plot makes the whole character end up feeling hollow, just like the monsters he fights. And that's the danger of the passive protagonist. When a character spends too much of the story reacting to whatever happens next, they slowly stop feeling like the person driving it. They start feeling like a passenger in their own story. But lacking a goal isn't the only way a protagonist can lose a part of what makes them interesting. And the third and final problem is trauma-centered characterization, specifically over-relying on it. It's almost impossible to open a shonen without a tragic backstory attached to someone. Dead parents, doomed hometown, a world-ending prophecy. And that's fine. Trauma gives context to why a character acts the way they do. The problem is that trauma becomes a reason for every single thing they do. It almost hurts me to say this, but he grew up isolated as the human vessel of the nine-tailed fox. So many of his deepest connections eventually come back to the same question. Do you understand what it's like to be alone? Naruto and Sasuke are completely different people. But one of the things tying them together is that both of them understand what it's like to grow up alone. Same thing happens with Gaara. During the Chunin exams, Naruto realizes that Gaara isn't some completely alien monster. He's someone who experienced the same kind of isolation Naruto did, and responded to it differently. Naruto can reach Gaara because he looks at him and sees the person he himself could have become. And years later, the same basic mechanism appears again with Nagato. Naruto doesn't defeat his worldview just by overpowering him. He understands the pain that created it. Naruto, though, is genuinely great at that. His ability to recognize someone suffering and still see the person underneath, that's one of his best qualities. But eventually, Naruto starts feeling less like someone's friend and more like a battle therapist. Because when trauma becomes the primary language characters use to understand each other, their relationships can start feeling defined by what broke them, instead of who they are when they're simply allowed to exist. And that's the danger of trauma-centered characterization. A tragic past can explain a character. It just shouldn't consume them. Usually main characters fall into one of these three traps. Sometimes they fall into more than one at the same time. At first, these look like completely different problems. Goku keeps getting stronger without letting his experiences permanently change him. Ichigo keeps getting pulled into each arc without a goal of his own driving the story. Naruto keeps forming some of his deepest connections through shared trauma. But underneath all three is the same problem. They keep progressing, but they stop transforming. Eventually, the story finds one version of the character that works, and keeps bringing them back to it. And that's exactly what Luffy does better than everyone else. Luffy and Goku do share similarities. They both love eating, fighting, and asking the dumbest questions. Goku was even one of Luffy's biggest inspirations. The difference is, Luffy actually grows from his experiences. Take Water 7. When the Going Mari can no longer continue sailing, Luffy makes a decision a captain has to make. They need a new ship. The problem is he completely fails to understand what that decision means to Usopp. To Luffy, they're losing a ship. To Usopp, they're abandoning a crewmate because she isn't strong enough to keep going. And considering Usopp already sees himself as the weakest member of the crew, you can probably see where this is going. The argument explodes. Usopp challenges Luffy. The two fight, and even though Luffy wins, Usopp leaves the crew. Luffy made the correct decision about the Marine, but he had absolutely no idea how to handle the person standing in front of him. That's a bad look for a captain. Now contrast that with Whole Cake Island. Years later, Luffy's thrown into almost the same dilemma. A crewmate is leaving. Sanji walks away to an arranged marriage and refuses to come back. He insults Luffy, he kicks him, he beats him into the ground. And this time Luffy understands what the person in front of him is actually saying. Sanji isn't abandoning the crew because he wants to. He's protecting the people he cares about. So Luffy doesn't fight back. He doesn't let his pride turn into another Usopp situation. Instead, this man, who would probably sell all of us for a plate of meat, goes on a hunger strike. He waits for Sanji. Because this time, Luffy understands that dragging his friend back isn't the answer. Sanji has to choose to come back himself. And that's the important part. The childishness is still there. The stubbornness is definitely still there. He's still the same idiot who gets excited whenever someone says the word meat. Oda didn't remove any of that to make Luffy more mature. Luffy is still the same person. What changed is how he treats the people around him. And that's something Goku struggles with. Goku can spend years getting stronger and still make the same childish call when his love of fighting gets in the way. Luffy's growth works differently. His mistakes actually change the choices he makes when life puts him in a similar situation again. Goku stays a child who gets stronger. Luffy stays a child who grows up. Luffy's goal has been clear since day one. He wants to be the king of the pirates. That's because Luffy is an active protagonist. His own goals and motivations give the story somewhere to go before the next villain ever shows up. Think about the scar under his eye. Back in Fuchsia village, Luffy grabs a knife from Shanks and cuts his own cheek open, just to prove he's tough enough to sail the seas. Nobody's threatening him, nobody needs saving. Nothing is forcing him to do anything. Even as a kid, Luffy's willing to put himself in danger because he already knows the kind of life he wants. And that's where Luffy and Ichigo differ. Ichigo has a very real reason to fight. He wants to protect his family and the people he loves. But his story usually needs something to threaten those people before it has somewhere to send him. Luffy already has somewhere to go. The Grand Line, the One Piece, Pirate King. And that actually makes Marineford even more interesting. Because when Ace gets captured, Luffy isn't being given a goal for the first time. He's being forced to choose between the goal he already has and someone he loves. He can keep sailing toward his dream and accept that Ace is going to die. Or he can abandon that journey completely and throw himself into a war against people far stronger than him. Luffy chooses Ace. He breaks into Impel Down. He charges into Marineford, admirals, warlords, an entire military fleet. None of it changes the decision he's already made. And that's what makes Luffy an active protagonist. The plot can interrupt his journey, it can derail him, it can even force him to abandon his goal temporarily. But it almost never has to invent a reason for Luffy to start moving in the first place. Ichigo's story usually asks what happened that Ichigo now has to respond to. Luffy's story asks, what does Luffy want and what is he willing to do to get there? Luffy doesn't need to understand someone's pain before letting them into his life. Take Nami. When Luffy meets her, he doesn't know a single thing about her past. He has no idea about Arlong, Bellemere, or why she hates pirates, and it doesn't matter to him. Luffy trusts Nami. That's enough. Compare that to Naruto, where so many of his strongest connections are built around understanding someone's pain. He recognizes the loneliness in Gaara, the pain in Nagato, and a version of himself in Sasuke. Their wounds become part of the reason why Naruto is able to reach them. Luffy skips that step entirely. During Arlong Park, he doesn't need Nami to sit down and explain everything Arlong did to her before deciding she deserves his help. In fact, Luffy barely cares about hearing the story. He just knows his friend is hurting. And when Nami finally asks for help, that's enough. You can see the same thing happen with Zoro. Luffy doesn't recruit Zoro because he learns his tragic backstory. He doesn't pity him because he's tied up at a marine base. He watches Zoro refuse to abandon what he believes in. even when it might get him killed. And Luffy immediately decides, yeah, I want that guy. That's it. That's the whole audition. No shared wound required, no mutual trauma to bond over. Luffy just sees something he respects and decides he likes the person attached to it. And that's what makes his relationships feel different. He doesn't have one emotional formula for becoming someone's friend. Nami earns his trust. Zoro earns his respect. Usopp makes him laugh. Sanji feeds him once and basically signs a lifetime contract. Different people give Luffy completely different reasons to care about them. And none of those relationships need to look the same to be real. That is the difference. Naruto often understands people by finding the wound they share. Luffy understands people by letting them show him who they are right now. Which makes sense. Remember, this is the same guy who tried recruiting a tree in Thriller Bark. Luffy doesn't need your tragic backstory. Sometimes he barely needs you to be human. So what actually connects all three of these things? Why can Luffy grow without becoming someone else? Why does he always have something of his own to chase? And why can he care about people without needing them to think, hurt, or live the same way he does? Because underneath everything else, Luffy is built around one idea: freedom. That's what he represents. Not freedom in some complicated political sense. Luffy's version is almost childish. He wants to become the freest man on the sea, chase whatever adventure he wants and wear Shanks' hat until he's earned the right to give it back. Everything else in his story gets built on top of that one thing. And more importantly, the story keeps trying to take it away from him. Twice, in ways big enough to genuinely rewrite who he is. The first is Ace. After Marineford, he loses his brother, right in front of him, even after sacrificing almost everything to save him. Losses like that tend to rewrite people. And for a while, it looks like that's exactly what's happening. Luffy completely shuts down. He can't move forward. He can't even process what just happened. But that's what makes what comes next so important. After the initial grief, we don't see Luffy obsessing over killing Akainu, and he doesn't turn his entire journey into revenge. Instead, he remembers what he still has: his crew and his dream. And after the time skip, he comes back as the same goofy captain who still wants to become king of the pirates. Marineford changes Luffy. It doesn't replace him. The second test is even bigger and much stranger. By Gear 5, Luffy isn't just some pirate chasing a treasure anymore. He's Nika. He's connected to Joy Boy. He's carrying centuries of history, expectation, and symbolism that existed long before he was born. That kind of revelation can swallow a protagonist whole. Suddenly the character stops being a person and starts being a prophecy. But watch what Luffy actually does with it. He helps his friend. That's it. All that power, legend, and mythology related to it, Luffy still uses it for the same reason he always fought. Because someone he cares about needs him. He doesn't even think of abandoning his dream to become the person history expects him to be. The world keeps trying to turn Luffy into something bigger than himself. Trauma tries to turn him into a man driven by revenge. Destiny tries to turn him into a symbol. And somehow neither one succeeds. They change what Luffy carries. They never change who gets to decide what Luffy does with it. And that's his core: freedom. And that's how Oda created a protagonist who never needed to become someone else to keep us rooting for him. And do you know what One Piece understands about world building that Hollywood doesn't? Or why Zoro works and everyone else fails?